title of my talk today is the title of a book that I'm working on. Hopefully I'll be finished with it by this summer. And I decided to write this book the day after the 2004 presidential election. That election really brought home to me the degree to which our country is deeply divided and I think deeply confused in some ways about moral values. The Bush administration, which is perhaps the most conservative administration in our history, had shown itself by even the 2004 election, I think, to be among the most duplicitous and malevolent administrations in our history. Yet a majority of the voting public, according to opinion polls, thought of the president as a man of substantial moral character and that his policies are based on firm moral values. And I was frankly puzzled by what these values are and what is meant by moral values if the Bush administration is the example. The 2004 election was just another in a long series of conservative victories and liberal defeats experienced over the last 40 years that illustrates, I think, how precipitously the moral credentials of liberalism have fallen out of favor. Most politicians run away from the word liberal, and polls show that less than 20% of the voting public identifies themselves as liberal. In fact, the vast majority of the people who say they are concerned about moral values identify themselves as conservatives. The word liberal in the public mind seems to be synonymous with some sort of moral corruption. By contrast, conservatism is often associated with strong moral character. This despite the fact that much of what we admire about the achievements of the United States and its influence on the world has been a direct result of the triumph of liberalism. For much of the 20th century, when the United States was becoming an economic and military powerhouse, as well as a beacon of freedom and prosperity and advancing equality, the governing philosophy of the United States was liberalism. Yet today, its moral credentials seem to be in tatters, defeated even by a transparently bankrupt and corrupt conservative movement, which suggests to me that there are problems with liberalism. Its message is not getting through, and the problem, of course, may be not with the messenger, but with the message in some way. Of course, I think in light of the unraveling of the Bush administration that we are currently witnessing, conservatism is in crisis. But the question is, can liberalism pick up the pieces? If liberalism has lost its moral credentials, it's not clear that it can pick up the pieces unless we succeed in transforming liberalism into a political ideology that has a clear moral foundation. So my purpose in writing this book is to explain what has happened, why have the moral credentials of liberalism been revoked, and to offer suggestions about how this can be reversed. I'm not attempting a historical explanation, since I'm not a historian. Rather, I'm interested in a philosophical explanation. I think that the attractions and the problems of both conservatism and liberalism are at bottom philosophical. They have to do with competing views of how we conceptualize moral value. So I treat both conservatism and liberalism as political ideologies that embody a moral philosophy. And I try to analyze where these moral philosophies go wrong. In the first part of the book, I explain why conservatism is attractive but dangerous nonsense. In the second part of the book, I look at the deficiencies of liberalism and try to explain why it has been unable to mount a moral defense of its political ideology. And the third part is devoted to revising liberalism in a way that makes its moral agenda clear. Now, this is obviously a very, very complex set of issues, and I can't treat in any kind of comprehensive way all of them today, but I want to give a rough overview of what the basic argument is, and then read a portion of a section devoted to revising liberalism, since that's, I think, certainly the part that I'm most interested in. So I'm going to start with a brief characterization of what conservatism and liberalism are, and where they go wrong as moral philosophies. Now, the basic issues that modern political philosophy has to deal with were elaborated by a philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes in the 16th century, a British philosopher in the 16th century. As many of you know, Hobbes is the founder of modern social contract theory. And even today, we think of ourselves as being governed by this idea of a social contract. So Hobbes set the agenda not only for modern political philosophy, but also for modern political institutions. Both conservatism and liberalism are responding to Hobbes's problem, though I think they deal with the problem in quite different ways. Hobbes asserted that human beings are fundamentally selfish. They're controlled by powerful and unlimited desires. And the most important value for human beings is the freedom to attempt to satisfy these desires. However, resources that can satisfy them are scarce, which means that we fight over them constantly. And so Hobbes argued that without the moderating influence of civilization, human life would be, as he says, nasty, brutish, and short, total war 24/7. So if civilized life is to be possible, these infinitely destructive desires must be restrained somehow. And this is the problem that government faces then, is how do you get people to restrain their desires in order to cooperate so we can get our basic needs satisfied? Well, happily, in addition to being selfish, we are also rational, according to Hobbes. What he means by rational, though, is very important. By rational, what he means is that we are capable of figuring out the most effective way of satisfying our desires. So in other words, we're able to get our means lined up with our ends. That's what he means by rational. So Hobbes argued then that the rational thing to do for each of us is to agree to a social contract. Each of us must agree to limit our freedom so that we can get our basic desires for food and shelter and so on satisfied. So it is rational for me to give up my natural desire to do anything I want in order to secure the cooperation of others and hence satisfy my basic needs. And with this agreement then, we avoid total war. Now of course Hobbes is not arguing here that we actually as individuals sign a contract, but he's arguing that it's rational for us to agree to the conditions of social cooperation. He's trying to establish the rationality behind the formation of society and civilization. But the problem is that even when we realize that we have to cooperate, even when that is apparent to us as rational beings, peace is not yet at hand because contracts require trust in order to secure the parties' agreement. If I don't believe that other parties to the agreement will hold up their end of the bargain, well, then I have no reason to limit my desires, and we're back to a condition of total war. So if this contract is to be effective, we have to trust each other. But what's the basis for this trust that's needed for the social contract to look like a good deal if we're all selfish desire machines, as Hobbes thinks that we are? Well, Hobbes thought that given our nature, only a totalitarian political authority, what he calls the Leviathan, with the power to force citizens into honoring the social contract, would guarantee that trust. Now, obviously, this is not an acceptable answer to this question of how we secure social trust, since a totalitarian political authority seems incompatible with liberty and equality and democracy and so on. And so political theory since Hobbes has been trying to come up with a better answer than he did, accepting the basic terms of the social contract and coming up with a better answer of how it gets enforced. So that's the problem that political theory confronts, and it's the problem that political institutions confront as well. The basic problem is how do we secure the basis for social cooperation, what I call social trust. Now, conservatives generally accept Hobbes' view that human desires spiral out of control unless they're reined in by very powerful constraints. But they argue that liberty is possible only if individuals restrain their own desires. And this is what's important for conservatism, is that we restrain our own desires. So self-sufficiency and self-restraint are political as well as personal virtues for conservatism. When we restrain ourselves, we do not need excessive government power to keep our rampaging desires from disrupting agreements. And when citizens rely on themselves for their sustenance, they require fewer agreements that need enforcement. So the aim of conservative political philosophy is to encourage self-restraint and self-sufficiency. And thus, if the citizens embody those virtues, they will have liberty, since you don't require the Leviathan, the totalitarian political authority. But what motive do we have for becoming such pillars of restraint? I mean, if Hobbes is correct about our selfish nature, I should want to acquire as much as I can from others, at least cost to myself, cooperating only when necessary. So why should I wish to persistently limit my desires through self-restraint? And why should I strive to be self-sufficient if I can get a free ride on the resources of others? Again, the issue of social trust arises. Well, the conservative answer is that society will have to be arranged in such a way that we are forced to acquire the virtues of self-sufficiency and self-restraint. Indeed, the conservative political agenda is devoted to developing a social and political culture of sanctions that encourage or coerce individuals to become economically self-sufficient and to rein in their desires to conform to traditional values. Hobbes' totalitarian government is replaced with a kind of soft authoritarianism of normative regulation, and not carried out necessarily by the government, but carried out by civil society. So society has to be arranged as a system of rewards and punishments that enforces conformity by exposing individuals to the full consequences of their actions. By exposing them to the consequences of their actions, you make them acquire self-sufficiency. You make citizens acquire self-sufficiency and self-restraint. So as a consequence, we get a whole litany then of conservative policies that you're familiar with if you follow political debates. The poor should not receive welfare because that would reward and encourage laziness and incompetence. Social security and pension benefits discourages people from planning adequately for retirement and should be privatized. Medical insurance encourages people to request unnecessary health care. It should be arranged to force people to pay out of pocket. Pregnant women should not have the option of abortion, and condoms should not be readily available because these encourage irresponsible sex. Clean needle programs for addicts are ill-advised because they eliminate incentives for stopping drug use. Government documents translated into Spanish discourage immigrants from learning English. Consumer protection legislation encourages carelessness regarding one's purchases, so consumers should be on their own if they make a bad purchase. And permitting same-sex marriage only encourages deviant behavior. Only when people are not protected from the bad consequences of their choices do they have an incentive to correct their behavior and follow moral absolutes by acquiring the virtues of self-restraint and self-sufficiency. And only when people are sure that moral absolutes are in place that everyone's going to follow these moral absolutes will we have the requisite social trust to guarantee cooperation. And of course, in foreign affairs, there is no basis for trust at all because there is no political authority to enforce agreements. So a military force to advance our interests is really ultimately the only recourse we have. So the aim of conservatism is to transform the moral personality of Americans, to get them to moderate their desires by exposing them to the competition of the free market and the sanctions of authoritarian social institutions, especially religion. If people are not protected from the consequences of bad desires, and if they're forced to compete in a free market that punishes bad behavior, they will have to acquire the strength of will to moderate their own activity. So private morality, the morality that governs one's personal life, really matters to conservatives because it is necessary to guarantee public order and to preserve liberty. Now, if this system of rewards and punishments is to be effective at rebuilding the soul, there must be moral absolutes enforced by clear lines of authority that prescribe the limits of possible conduct. Ambiguity about what behavior is expected or who has the authority to enforce sanctions will weaken the message and permit deviations that weaken the will. Thus, institutions organized in hierarchies that depend on the exercise of authority are essential to conservative views of how society must function. Religious institutions, the traditional patriarchal family, successful businesses, law enforcement, and the military are worthy of special respect because of the discipline they impose. So conservatism advocates arranging society as a system of authoritarian hierarchical institutions rooted in cultural traditions as the means of solving Hobbes' problem of how to get people to cooperate. Now, I think there are various problems with this approach, and I spend a number of chapters in the book delineating these problems. I don't want to focus on them today because I want to get to liberalism, but let me just briefly summarize. I think the authoritarianism is incompatible with equality and liberty. It provides no way of constraining the desires of the authorities that have power. So it's prone to corruption and the abuse of power. The free market doesn't restrain our desires, but constantly generates new desires that disrupt traditions and undermine traditional values. The idea that we acquire moral value through response to authority is incompatible with the empirical evidence we have about moral development. Appeals to traditional values don't resolve moral disagreements, but they lead directly to relativism and irresolvable conflict. And the virtue of self-sufficiency in the end does not encourage social trust, but in fact undermines it because we're forced to see ourselves as isolated individuals who don't need to cooperate. So needless to say, I think this is not the right answer to Hobbes's problem, although it has been very, very attractive to voters over the last 30, 40 years. Well, how does liberalism then solve Hobbes's problem? Well, traditional liberalism also begins with the premise that human beings are fundamentally self-interested, and that the most important thing for us is our private interests and the freedom to pursue them. So liberty is fundamental to traditional liberalism. But we are capable of reasoning in a much more robust sense than Hobbes thought, according to liberals. Remember that Hobbes thought that reason really is just about finding the most efficient way to satisfy my desires. But the liberal tradition has argued, quite powerfully I think, that we can engage in genuine moral reasoning as well, not just about how to achieve our desires, but how to do what is right. But because our natural desires are fundamentally selfish, we can reason about moral values only when we separate ourselves from our desires and attachments and emotions and strive to be as objective and as impartial as possible. So the ideal in liberalism is that when we enter the public sphere to deliberate about political questions, we have to leave behind our personal concerns and think in terms of the common good and universal rights and equality. On moral and political questions, we're supposed to be just as impartial as the scientist in the laboratory or a judge trying to impartially decide a legal matter. We're supposed to deliberate while being detached from our own experience. This is then how we limit our desires, through our capacity to reason objectively and impartially. And this allegedly promotes social cooperation because it enables people with quite different personal moralities to agree on a public morality, although a very thin one, but nevertheless a public morality. So liberalism requires a very sharp split between our private lives and our public obligations. We're supposed to see ourselves in one way as a private individual, in quite a different way when we engage in political debate and so on. So as a consequence, liberalism has traditionally been concerned with the fairness of the rules that govern public institutions. It doesn't have much to say about personal morality. Now, I think that the problem is, and it's not just my thought, but there have been many critiques of this over the centuries since liberalism was first elaborated. The problem, I think, is that this conception of reason as impartial and objective is unavailable to us in the realm of ethics and politics. Most people are not going to be enthusiastic about ignoring their personal attachments and private pursuits when engaging in political deliberation. Liberalism, I think, has always had difficulty trying to explain our motive for this kind of high-minded, impartial reason. So the kind of reasoning that liberalism wants people to engage in seems very abstract and very disconnected from their personal lives. And the split between the public and the private is very difficult to negotiate for many people. And liberalism has, in fact, been accused of being concerned only with government bureaucracies that are unresponsive to people's personal concerns. Well, if liberalism is committed to the view that the only way we can think about the common good is through this very abstract, impersonal kind of reasoning, where I try to take my own desires and attachments out of the picture, and if this form of reasoning is unavailable to us, well then liberal politics will not only be unpopular, but it will degenerate into a collection of disparate interest groups, or it will degenerate into some form of identity politics, which of course has happened over the last 30, 40 years. For liberalism, reason has moral authority. But if that reason is unavailable to us, the very moral core of liberalism is compromised. So it's no wonder that liberalism has lost its attraction. So, conservatism and liberalism disagree fundamentally on the question of what has moral authority. For conservatives, it is the authority of tradition and the powers that exercise that authority within institutions. For liberals, it is reason. But I think neither answer seems adequate to our political moment. So, well, if those two answers are incorrect, then what does have moral authority? What gets us to restrain our desires and build social trust so that we can cooperate? This is the question, I think, that progressive liberalism, a new kind of liberalism, would have to answer. So I want to turn now to one of the chapters in the book, which is attempting to articulate an alternative moral vision for liberalism. The chapter is called "You Put the Load Right on Me," which you might recognize as a lyric from a song called "The Weight" by a band called The Band from the 60s. Some of you may be familiar with it. Most of you probably not. In this chapter, I articulate one of the key concepts in this moral vision by reference to a film. And this is an old film, a Western, called The Searchers, starring John Wayne. How many of you have seen The Searchers? Okay. A few have. I highly recommend it. It's one of the classic films in the tradition of Westerns. But I think there's a particular scene in this film that I want to talk a little bit about. So this is from the chapter, "You Put the Load Right on Me." It is surely an exaggeration to say that our lives are a dress rehearsal for the digitally displayed iconography that commands our rapt attention from the couch across the room. But occasionally an episode in a film crystallizes some profound dimension of human experience that goes unnoticed in the daily grind. And among the most profound is the penultimate scene in John Ford's The Searchers, starring the American icon John Wayne as Ethan Edwards. The Searchers distills our ethical relations down to a single molecule that carries the viral infection keeping our fragile hopes alive. Ethan Edwards is a Confederate soldier recently returned to his homestead after the Civil War, bitter and angry and harboring a racist hatred for the Comanches who live nearby. Ethan's brother and his family have been eking out a living running the farm, but when Ethan leaves to chase rustled cattle, the Comanches burn the farm to the ground, kill the adults, and capture the two daughters. A search party finds only the dead body of his older niece, so Ethan and his partner, Martin, embark on a bloodthirsty 5-year quest to find the younger niece, Debbie. Ethan discovers her living as a Comanche squaw with a brave who abducted her. Furious that she has assimilated to Comanche ways, contaminated and no longer of his tribe, Ethan tries to kill her and fails only because Martin intervenes and enables Debbie to escape. Ethan, driven neither by love nor honor, but by his racist obsession with sexual contamination, is now more determined than ever to dispose of this insult. He rounds up the old posse and attacks the Comanche camp, killing and scalping the Comanche leader and chasing down Debbie, who attempts to run away. Trapped in the mouth of a cave, Debbie cowers as Ethan brings him up short, as Ethan bears down on her. As he gathers his will to murder, Debbie's terrified face brings him up short, rendering him incapable of carrying out the act that had driven his 5-year quest for revenge and purity. He walks to her, picks her up in his arms, and says, "Let's go home, Debbie." Now, this scene depicts a plain moral truth. Our moral capacities are provoked by the unmediated presence of a vulnerable human being. The cognitive boundaries we erect to keep out others, whether motivated by principles or doctrines, traditions, or fantasies of conquest and purification, can all seem small and threadbare when confronted by actual living, breathing persons and their needs. Even the vicious racism of a war-addled, damaged personality like Ethan's, steeped in violence and heated by a 5-year quest for revenge, is no match. The Lithuanian philosopher Immanuel Levinas developed the metaphor, the face of the other, to refer to this capacity of vulnerable people to cut through the tentacles of our will and intellect and set free our capacity for moral response. Ethan recognizes in Debbie's face that she has needs beyond his needs, a way of being that is not reducible to how he sees her. She does not belong to him, and her vulnerabilities are not an extension of his. She is singular, with an identity all her own and irreplaceable. Her vulnerability presses in on Ethan and holds him hostage. He cannot commit murder, even for a cause he believes is just. This is the meaning of the metaphor, the face of the other. Even a monster such as Ethan can have this epiphany, though among monsters he may be exceptional. The face of the other invades our self-satisfied conscience with the message that the singular identity of another person is of consummate worth. Human beings cannot be fully assimilated to the way we imagine them, and their vulnerabilities must not be exploited. Our response to the face is the paradigmatic moral response from which all other moral responses flow, because this experience alone suspends our will, interrupts our drive to consume and exploit, enabling us to take heed of the needs of others. Most of us have had this experience, a visceral response to the suffering or vulnerability of another person that induces us to act to their benefit. We feel this when the palpable presence of another person weighs on us, when the other person is not an abstract member of a category, but an individual engaging oneself also as an individual. At these moments, we are moved to sacrifice, to make the welfare of others the locus of our concern. The face of the other does not literally refer to a particular face. Again, it's a metaphor. And the other is not someone who is odd, unfamiliar, or foreign. The face of the other, as a metaphor, picks out two fundamental dimensions of any person. One, her vulnerability, and two, her relationship to her inner life, her interior scape that is beyond our comprehension. So you can see why the face is an appropriate metaphor here, because it's the face that expresses a person's vulnerability. Pain is usually registered on the face, the effects of aging usually registered on the face. And also, it's through the face that we recognize that another person has an inner life all their own, an inner life that we may know something about, but not too much about. We don't really have access to it. There's something about the other person that escapes our description of it. It is our receptiveness to the command of the face of the other that enables us to be moral beings. Without the intervention of the face, our ambitions, fears, and enthusiasms trample any seedling of human difference left exposed to the elements. When we treat others as members of abstract categories, when we replace living, breathing persons with abstract ideas, legal rules, or principles of conduct, even if they are finally and acutely justified, they too easily become mere expressions of our will. We become agents of these intermediaries rather than advocates of charity and peace, and the face of the other is veiled. The face of the other cannot be subordinate to the moral law, to legal rules, the common good, religious doctrine, national solidarity, or any of the other abstractions in the name of which we excuse violence. None of these imperatives quite capture the nature and significance of another person. And when we treat others as nothing but ciphers represented by these imperatives, we do them irreparable harm. Although it is natural to understand ourselves in part as Americans or Mexicans, Protestants or Muslims, these descriptions leave out what is essential about human beings, their radical particularity. Furthermore, we must concern ourselves with the common good, and we must specify the legal and moral rules that govern our common life as well. But through all of these practical allegiances and modes of self-understanding, the face of the other must be allowed to speak, reminding us that a uniquely valuable living presence is under constant threat from the descriptions we carelessly use as placeholders. We do not mobilize moral values by defiantly defending a principle or sticking slavishly to some phrase in an ancient text. We do not honor them by conforming to conventions or by setting oneself up as impartial judge and jury, convinced of our rectitude and wisdom. We mobilize moral values by nurturing in ourselves the capacity to be held hostage by the vulnerability of others. When we act in the name of anything but the face of the other, moral conscience is at risk. Yet the political crosswinds of our age enjoin us to ignore the face. We are seduced by the dream of the system, by the idea that the operations of efficient economic markets, the laws of the state, the doctrines of a faith or tradition, or the regulations of bureaucracies provide us with all the moral guidance we need, enabling us to evade with a clear conscience the unsettling demands of the singular face that cannot be systematized. We are encouraged to draw platitudes from ancient texts and imbue them with false clarity and phony profundity and call them traditional values, so we don't have to think or negotiate with the anxieties of the faces before us. We are implored to drink with mother's milk the cynical judgment that everyone is at bottom evil, making it an easy matter to erase the face through violence and mayhem. Our political ideologies would prefer that the face of the other wear a veil, so it can offer no resistance to the world of commerce and war. To the extent these ideologies succeed in obscuring the face of the other, they lack a moral foundation. So it's the concrete presence then of another person that has moral authority, I'm arguing. The next section is called An Ethic of Responsibility, and in this section I'm trying to articulate a different approach to the problem of social trust than the one that's offered by the tradition of social contract theory. In the previous chapter, I argued that the American dream is dependent on relationships of care that extend beyond our self-interested needs. In this chapter, we see that these relationships are not wholly based on practical concerns or perceptions of similarity, familiarity, or solidarity. Intimations of particularity and vulnerability, captured metaphorically as the face of the other, provoke our conscience regardless of the categories to which we assign people or the ways in which we make use of them. These relationships, based on the provocation of the face, are the foundation of social reality. Ethan's refusal to murder Debbie took place in a context of high drama, fraught with devastating losses and dangerous passions. But this visceral response to the vulnerability of others is not a rare occurrence, popping up only when brutes threaten lambs. It is a constant presence in our lives, the very foundation of the generosity that makes social life possible. What could be more ordinary than walking through a crowded shopping mall full of strangers? Yet even in this cathedral of consumption, the face of the other implicitly demands a modicum of generosity from me. Each person I encounter at the mall, numbly gazing at the spectacle of boundless commerce, commands me not to harm her. And I must respond to this command. In each encounter, it is wholly my responsibility to initiate gestures of goodwill toward the other person, though I can know nothing of her intentions. My welcome mat must be visible, but without the secure knowledge that others will reciprocate. Reciprocity depends on me making the first move. If I were to hold back, inhibit the subtle gestures of goodwill that emanate from me, wait for others to declare their intentions before receiving assurances, lurch between preparations for fight or flight, mall security would descend on me like Orc defending Sauron's castle. Or to put the point more succinctly, any conversation that begins with "I might kill you" has gone nowhere. The easy social commerce that our lives depend on requires that we obey the command issued by the face of the other. In each encounter, regardless of how inconsequential, the other person is commanding me to take a responsible attitude toward her vulnerabilities, beseeching me not to exploit them, imploring me to preserve her separate identity. She demands this of me, regardless of how much I know or do not know about her. In every encounter, the other person designates me as someone who must be responsible, as someone who has the ability and obligation to respond to her needs. She commands my attention and care. As inherently social beings, we are implicitly aware of this command that others make whenever they are present to us, in body or in language. But of course, I am making the same demand on other persons as well. I command the other person to take a responsible attitude toward my vulnerabilities, to acknowledge my singularity. I depend on her forbearance, though my gesture of goodwill is not dependent on hers, and hers not on mine, since each of us must make the first move. These commands to be responsible are the glue that sustains society, fundamental facts of social reality to which we must attend. We could not function as social beings without them, because in the absence of these commands, and the generosity of our reply, the only rational reaction to encountering another person would be fight or flight, which is rarely our response. Relationships, even between anonymous strangers, rest on trust, and trust rests on the intelligibility of this command. Of course, what I should or should not do in response to the command issued by the face is dependent on context. Sometimes I should simply refrain from harming her. Sometimes I must actively promote her aims. Sometimes I must sacrifice my aims, as Ethan sacrificed his. But in any case, a refusal to exploit vulnerabilities is commanded. Upon meeting a stranger, she makes demands on me. I am bound by her command to be responsible. Although I may refuse to acknowledge this constraint, it is already there prior to any communication or reflection. There is already moral authority in this relationship before anyone assumes a position of power. I am making the same demand on her, and she is bound as well. But my command is not contingent on hers, and hers not contingent on mine. The command exists before any negotiation takes place. It is an implicit assumption, not the product of discourse, reason, or agreement. Neither is it a product of God's word or a characteristic of some tradition or community. Most importantly, it is not my choice. That I am being held responsible for others because they are dependent on me, and that others are held responsible by me because I am dependent on them, are brute facts of our social existence that originate in our fundamental attachment to the world as vulnerable beings, and our sense of ourselves as agents able to act. This command to be responsible is the basis for social trust, a kind of relationship that enables all of our other relationships. Without it, human existence as we know it would be impossible, and personal autonomy and happiness unachievable. It is essential that any society that seeks peace and human flourishing actively acknowledge, through its institutions and norms, our utter dependence on this responsibility to the face of the other. Any discussion of the moral status of our social and political institutions must answer the question of how responsibility toward the face is enabled and preserved. Yet conservatism repels the face in an orgy of war and indifference, while traditional liberalism is easily distracted from it by the wall of separation it erects between public space and private worlds, and its focus on government procedures and the demands of bureaucratic organization. Progressive liberalism, by contrast, so I am proposing, is defined by its willingness to make responsibility toward the face the foundation of its politics. So the face, then, the face of the other is what has authority. I want to say a little bit then about what the nature of this authority is, because it's unlike any other authority that we're aware of. The next section is entitled A Cynic's Lament. It is a fact of social life that others hold us responsible for their safety. And it is a fact of human psychology that most of us sense their command and feel burdened by it. Only the monstrous are oblivious to remorse, guilt, and conscience. Nevertheless, the other can refuse to act on my command, and I can refuse to act on hers. Sometimes we do go to war. We often act irresponsibly and often play fast and loose with social trust. Moral authority, unlike legal authority, is not backed by force. The face of the other doesn't carry a gun. It issues a command with few enforcement provisions. Furthermore, the face of the other competes with our other powerful motives, such as self-interest, affection, or a desire for solidarity with like-minded people. So there is ample room for the cynic, with his exorbitant, hard-headed realism, to hurl invective at the face of the other. Why should I acknowledge and respond to this command to be responsible if I'm not forced into it, especially when others can so routinely violate it? Well, there are consequences to acting without regard for the face of the other. The most immediate is that others will accuse me of irresponsibility. The other person always has the option to withhold assent to my treatment of her, to judge me as irresponsible. This capacity to judge me irresponsible is the only ethical power that the other person has over me. So why should I care about this accusation? Asked the cynic. Why is her disapproval sufficient to encourage me to take responsibility for her safety? To answer the cynic, I think we have to look at how the capacity for agency develops and how the absence of a moral concern for others disrupts our own agency. We develop our agency, by agency I just simply mean our capacity to act. We develop our agency through our response to the face of the other. As children, we learn very early that our parents have minds of their own and vulnerabilities that our actions can allay or exploit. Through parental commands to be responsible, children learn to discriminate between desires they should act on and desires that are best left unsatisfied. The self develops as a structure of care, motivated by the face of the other, that is her parents, in which the importance of encouraging trust is absolutely essential. As the child develops, she learns that people other than her parents have vulnerabilities, expectations and needs that she can satisfy, and the structure of care develops as the child continues to mark a distinction between the desires that she happens to have at the moment that may or may not need satisfaction, and the values that really matter that must be acted on. In other words, the command issued by the face of the other motivates the child to acquire self-control. As a result, by the time she attains full agency, she will have already acquired a self that has internalized the desire to encourage and expect trust. At full adult agency, if all goes well, there is a reasonably coherent fit between desires, values, and her actions in the world. She achieves wholehearted integrity. At least this is our ideal. To become a dynamic, uninterrupted will, a force of nature with little confusion or misdirection, a self-satisfied conscience with a minimum of conflict between what we want, what we most deeply want, and our actions. Although impossible to realize in a complex world, this ideal of a dynamic, uninterrupted will is a hallucination worth having. The absence of internal conflict engorges the self with a joyful sensibility that life is under control. Our actions and everyday desires conform to what we value. Actions flow from the self, not from external forces, and we are free and our powers seem unlimited. However, although the face of the other provokes the emergence of the self through the process of moral development that I just described, it also continually shatters the self-satisfied conscience. It renders inert this dynamic, uninterrupted will. Whenever the vulnerability of others is present, this coherence between what we care about, what we want, and what we do is being questioned, brought up short by the accusation that I must respect the other's vulnerability. What I want or what I do cannot be reconciled with who I take myself to be and what the other demands of me. The palpable presence of vulnerable others challenges me to be more responsible, trustworthy, and critical of my desires and actions. My freedom experiences itself as unjustified and must give an account of itself. Only by giving that account can freedom be restored. In interrupting the dynamism of an integrated self, the face of the other challenges me to ask whether my actions and my desires live up to my core commitments. The face of the other has such profound effects because it questions my commitment to social trust, which is the foundation of any relationship, and under normal circumstances is deeply woven into the structure of the self, as the foundation of my own freedom. Only by responding to the command to be responsible can we repair this fissure in the self, thus restoring some measure of self-satisfaction and self-control, however compromised. The face of the other is a constant provocation that demands the constant reweaving of the self, the refurbishing of the structure of desire and my structure of care, and my commitment to it. To turn away from the command of responsibility is to threaten the conditions of my own agency, because the basis for my action, the coherence between desires, values, and actions, cannot be assured. It is the ability to bear the weight of responsibility for others that confers whatever coherence the self attains. Without the provocation of the face, the self is disconnected from reality, wandering aimlessly from desire to desire like bric-a-brac floating in a weightless environment. My taking up the command of others enables genuine freedom by anchoring the self in fields of gravity where choices have significance. To see oneself as responsible is to enable one's capacities to nurture what one cares about. Yet this is freedom rimmed with poignancy. Self-satisfaction is by necessity compromised, and self-control only a matter of degree. For once the self is open to the face of the other, there are too many others to which we must respond. We cannot respond to one person's needs without taking bread from the mouth of another. We cannot be responsible without learning to live with the thought that ethics demands more of us than we can give. Moral strength is not found in the dynamism of an uninterrupted will, but in the integrity of a character that can respond to the face of the other, despite knowledge of the inadequacy of one's response. Strength of character lies in doing what we can while never forgetting our victims. This visceral, immediate response to the vulnerability of others conditions agency in ways that loyalty to principles, ideals, or traditional values cannot. Adherence to principles, ideals, or traditions involves only a monologue with myself. Self-talk that involves no burden from an unassailable other that can accuse me of irresponsibility. They have no power to disrupt the will. They supply self-satisfaction on the cheap, like playing air guitar or wiffle ball. Of course, moral risk does not make agency impossible. Some scoundrels manage to achieve something like happiness, and their agency appears uninhibited. But the obstacles to happiness and full agency, when incurring moral risk, are substantial, the hidden costs are debilitating, the threat of nihilism ever present. The disposition to ignore the face of the other inhibits my basic openness to the world, an openness that can be sustained only when vulnerabilities are mitigated through social trust. Freedom does not require anything like moral perfection. It requires the provocation of the face be given its due, and that one's response to the face is sufficient to sustain the social trust on which we all depend. So then, why can't we all just get along? If being responsive to the face of the other is so important to our agency, why do human beings routinely ignore the command to be responsible and allow the self to dissolve into incoherent fragments of desire? Although social life would be impossible if we always ignored the face of the other, it is obvious that we often quite willfully treat others badly. Warfare, cruelty, and indifference are so embedded in human life that it seems perverse to insist that responding to the face of the other is fundamental to the coherence of the self. Part of the explanation for brutality and violence is that many children fail to develop as moral agents. Children who grow up in violent or chaotic environments or under excessively authoritarian parenting will be unlikely to develop the capacity to trust or be trusted. When children fail to acquire the recognition that persons other than their parents have a face, trust will be limited to the family or to familiar others, thus inhibiting the capacity to develop comfortable relationships with others outside their immediate social context. However, I doubt that our moral failures can all be explained by stunted moral development. The more significant problem is that moral responsibility is always a burden. Others impose demands on us that we cannot satisfy. Thus, we develop a variety of mechanisms to relieve the pressure of accepting responsibility for others. We engage in massive self-deception about the needs of others. We construct elaborate fantasies of self-sufficiency that ignore trust and attempt to isolate ourselves from the consequences of the disapproval of others. All attempts to maintain the fiction of a dynamic, uninterrupted will. Because we always fail to do justice to the face of the other, we must endure the continual disruption of our integrity. We never get our values to fully conform to our first-order desires, and our actions seldom conform fully to our desires or the shape of the world. The best we can do is to limit the damage so that the gradual erosion of a relationship we care about is avoided. Because some degree of incoherence is unavoidable given the complexity of life, it is easy to become comfortable with excessive incoherence, deciding that moral response is not worth the effort, and shunting the hunger of a conscience not satisfied to the basement of consciousness where its moans are muffled by the garrulous cynic in the kitchen. Moreover, we can never eliminate all exploitation from human life. The command to be responsible is so demanding and disruptive that our social norms and institutions must act to lessen expectations by legitimating some forms of exploitation. For instance, in business transactions, it is appropriate to exploit a rival firm's lack of financing when developing a new product. But it's not appropriate to exploit their weak security systems in order to steal their design plans. I mean, in baseball, it's expected that the pitcher will exploit a hitter's inability to hit a breaking ball but it's not appropriate to doctor the baller to take his kid hostage until after the game. In every context, we narrowly circumscribe the kinds of exploitation permitted. But we must permit some exploitation if the entrepreneurial spirit is to flourish and our practices are to have the dynamism that enables growth. Boredom, torpor, and material deprivation are human vulnerabilities that morality by itself can't alleviate. If we do not permit some forms of exploitation, the face of the other is so excessively demanding that it is wholly disconnected from human flourishing. Yet these narrowly circumscribed eddies of permissible exploitation have a way of commingling with waves of hustle and enthusiasm. With excessive weakening of social trust, small permissible exploitations easily become graft, greed, and grisly murder. The illusion of a self-satisfied conscience is encouraged by authorities that preach doctrines of self-sufficiency that systematically obscure our dependence on others. It is encouraged by doctrines of national and cultural exceptionalism that construct much of the rest of the human race as evil or incompetent and worthy only of being manipulated or destroyed. When serious exploitation is encouraged as a norm, human vulnerabilities are viewed as opportunities for the fortunate to enhance their fortune. We draw lines in the sand and carefully delineate the worthy from the noxious, and the face of the other recedes. Without the persistent self-criticism invoked by the face of the other, moral responsibility cannot gain a foothold. If this self-criticism is not encouraged by social institutions, if the confidence of the dynamic will is sealed off from the accusation of the face by institutions bent only on acquiring more and more power, social trust erodes and moral responsibility declines. The genius of democracy is not that it allows us to choose, but that it allows us to choose the good. It enables the face of the other to limit the power of individuals and institutions, thereby preserving our capacity for moral response. Cynics have plenty of evidence at their disposal. Yet, despite our worst tendencies in this regard, an ethic of responsibility is our default condition, as it must be for any civilization that has accomplished as much as ours. This is the end of the chapters entitled The Ethical Relation in Society. So the upshot of this Levinasian-inspired ethic of responsibility is that morality is fundamentally about the moral obligations that one person owes to another. We are at our moral best when facing one other person or perhaps a small group of persons, when the relationship is direct, unmediated, when the singularity and vulnerability of the other can impress itself on me with its full significance. That moment when one's will is suspended, that fissure in the self, the visceral acknowledgement that the other person is vulnerable, beyond me, and higher than me, is a necessary condition for an ethical relationship. This ethical relation of one person to another constitutes society. Society is built out of these relationships because through the trust they generate, they enable our commerce and conversation. When we recover from this epiphany and ask who deserves what and what is fair, if our answers are to be just, they must be responsive to the face of the other. The motive for social justice lies in our personal relationship with others. The problem, of course, is that these feelings of commitment weaken as they are dispersed over too many relationships, and we suffer moral fatigue, not because we are weak, but because there's too much to do. It is likely that evolution has designed us this way because the conditions of life throughout much of human history demand that we respond to local emergencies. But we no longer live the sort of life that can be consumed by tending our own garden. The challenge of contemporary life, liberalism's challenge, is to preserve our capacity to respond to the face of the other. To preserve our capacity to respond to the face when the other's other and the other's other are present. Traditional liberalism has put forward the authority of an impartial, universal moral law, accessible to reason and mandating freedom and equality as an answer to this challenge. But although reason is important in giving us the big picture and determining how to carry out our obligations to others, it doesn't provide sufficient motive for morality. It doesn't split the self asunder and demand its rebuilding. Reason's demand for impartiality crumbles when confronted with human desire. In the absence of criticism provoked by the face of the other, reason will serve itself, swallowing the face of the other in an orgy of vanity and hubris. It will assume that the other is like me, and her needs are my needs. Reason will presume to know what cannot be known. With impartial reason alone, liberty and equality are left to fend for themselves, freestanding values that quickly lose their intelligibility as moral relations and degenerate into intergroup politics. Conservative appeals to the authority of tradition are even less successful. When conservatives sanctify our traditions, the face of the other is painted over with a mural of mythological heroes and forced to wear the spangles of natives dancing for the tourists. For conservatism and traditional liberalism, the ethical relation can exist only if it's mediated by some larger-than-life abstraction that, operating secretly behind the scenes, corrals our separated interior-scapes into a single encampment. The living, breathing person must be approached obliquely by a ruse. But traditions and texts and principles and institutions do not have a face. Only a mask that we foolishly mistake for a face. We cannot be obligated by these abstractions only to persons whose presence they mask. By contrast, progressive liberalism rests on the frank acknowledgement that nothing will save us but our own generosity. It views our ethical commitments in both private and public life as governed by a single motive, responsibility for the other. Though the other person may be a friend, a lover, a fellow citizen, or stranger, with each relationship governed by distinctly different norms and feelings and so on. Each relationship is made possible by this ethical relation that underlies all sociality. All human relationships share the command of the other as their foundation. No institution, tradition, or principle can substitute for the generosity of the face-to-face encounter. Yet we need institutions guided by principles and traditions to sustain social life. Most of our activities are supported by vast networks of unseen, anonymous actors, an ecology that requires sustenance if it is to survive. To see in this personal encounter which I have been describing the anonymous faces of those we never meet, we need institutions that enshrine the criticism of one person facing another, that nurture the fragile generosity and mutual responsibility that sustain social life. Only such institutions are worthy of being called moral. As individuals, we recognize the moral claims of others, but how are we to act on this recognition? Despite an accurate analysis of our predicament, and despite our personal moral motives, we seem to have no secure route to collective solutions. 30 years of conservative attacks on government and the incompetence of interest group liberalism have eroded confidence in government solutions. Our political ideologies offer only blind alleys that promise more fear and isolation. The first step in emerging from this bleak condition is to clarify a goal that cannot be subordinated to sectarian interests or co-opted by the avatars of corporate greed that today stalk the halls of our so-called public institutions. The most fundamental goal of our collective life is the rebuilding of social trust. For social trust is the anchor that makes whatever else we want an intelligible pursuit. Progressive liberalism is defined by its focus on leveraging our moral capacities in order to institute policies that build social trust, that encourage us to recognize and respond to the face of the other. A liberal politics that does not shy away from calling itself a moral politics. Questions? Yeah.
In your very interesting discussion of social trust, I'm just wondering, are you familiar with Robert Putnam?
Yes.
Okay.
Social capital.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he has a particular account of how social trust is built and so on.
Northern Italy versus Southern Italy is a case study.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I haven't read the case study, but I'm familiar with his work, and I mean, he thinks in terms of volunteer activity and so on. I tend to think that volunteer activity isn't sufficient, that our institutions, not only the voluntary ones, but the others that are not so voluntary, require the building of social trust as well. Yeah.
I was just thinking of the 2000 campaign, and I think the two most successful lines, applause lines for George W. Bush were, See, the difference between my opponent and me is this. He believes in the government, and I believe in the people.
Right.
That was one. And the other, referring to the temporary budget surplus, he thinks it belongs to the government, but it belongs to you. And that seemed to be simply irrefutable, or it was beyond Al Gore's capacity. But that it combined, obviously, selfishness and self-righteousness. I mean, that's formidable, isn't it? And how does a scrupulous person, effectively counter that kind of appeal?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult. I mean, it's a good question, and it's very hard, especially in something like a political campaign or something like that, to counter that sort of appeal, because it's, as I pointed out when I was introducing the concerns I have, it's deeply embedded in our society. I mean, our whole tradition assumes that we're fundamentally just selfish, that anything you sort of do is sort of secondary to that. And I think that much of our society thinks that. Certainly our political traditions assume that. And of course we are selfish. Self-interest is a terribly important motivation. I don't want to deny its importance. But there's another dimension to us as well that I think our political ideologies just kind of ignore. Because it's thought to be a matter of private life. It's a matter of, we have, we can recognize the face of the other when the other is my spouse or my child or something like that. But when it gets to these, impersonal social institutions like the government, well, then that's a whole different matter. I mean, I think there's a complex set of reasons why conservatism has become popular and why people are attracted to that. And part of it has to do with the failures of liberalism. I mean, liberalism, when the conservative movement got off the ground, there were lots of questions about whether our government institutions could be responsible and so on. People were suspicious of whether government institutions could solve problems. And the conservatives were able to capitalize on that worry. So I think it's a complex matter why that appeal has so much power to it. I mean, as I said, this idea of a dynamic, uninterrupted will is something that's also embedded in our traditions and so on. Something that's terribly important to us, and we don't like anything that interrupts that. And so consequently, I think conservatism appeals to people because it looks like if you just hang on to your money and hang on to your own resources and keep your nose to the grindstone and follow traditional values, everything gets solved. Everything is everything's in your power.
Why
you as an individual.
Why do you think it is that American culture is so profoundly different from European? I mean, for example, that Europeans pay 3 to 4 times as much for gasoline as we do. Because there is a recognition,
Not anymore, it's about twice.
that there are social costs, and that the commonweal is best preserved by keeping fuel prices high. There's no such recognition in this country. Absolute denial.
Right.
People will call themselves environmentalists, and then you ask, would you agree then to a 25-cent increase in the gas tax? Hey, wait a minute, Now, why this so profound difference between Canada and Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other?
First of all, there's going to be historical reasons for that, I suppose. I mean, part of the explanation is going to be a historical explanation, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing that Europe has faced that the United States isn't, and I think we can't ignore this, is the fact that Europe has been the scene of enormously destructive wars. Their concern about their society fragmenting and so on, I think is palpable for them, whereas we haven't been the scene of that. That operates in the background, I think, a lot of differences between Europe and the United States.
Yeah, I suppose.
There are other, I suspect, other things as well. But I mean, this notion of American individualism is just very powerful. It always has been. And of course, look, I mean, our traditions are born out of the frontier, when you had to be an individual, in the sense in which you were dependent on others. Your sense in which you were dependent on others in the frontier was very limited. You couldn't depend on others. You had to be self-sufficient. The mythology of the frontier and so on, where people had to be self-sufficient, or they couldn't survive. And what we admire about them is their self-sufficiency, and there is something admirable about that. We don't live in that society any longer, and a lot of people haven't woken up to that fact.
Just one short comment to that, that since my background is European, I do have to add something to this, that there's a certain malaise in the European psyche these days that they don't think that individual protests matter. And it takes a whole lot for Europeans to get together and make a protest.
You made the statement early, and I didn't quite get it. You said that the liberalism doesn't have access to the rational mind, and I didn't catch rationale for that.
Not the rational mind as a whole, but and there's a particular conception of rationality, okay, that liberalism seems to require. Okay, and it's this notion that when you enter the public sphere, you have to rid yourself of your self-interest and not just your self-interest, but your attachments to others and so on, your commitments, things like religion and so on. It's not supposed to be in the public sphere. When you enter the public sphere, you're supposed to be this kind of denatured person who deliberates about moral questions independently of your particular experience and so on.
So you're saying objectivism requires that?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
that therefore you're saying objectivism isn't one of the values of conservatism in politics?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I don't see that anyway.
I'm just going to throw out some concepts and see if I'm getting what you're after here. It seems like part of the danger of conservatism is that they never, that is an extreme acknowledgement of self-interest, and it never really veers away from that as being the ground of morality, a kind of ethical egoism that has to just be dealt with and controlled for cooperation. And in liberalism, it perhaps recognizes maybe that egoism isn't the best kind of ground for morality, so it opts for an abstracting away from that to think about the public sphere. Whereas in your ethic of care, it's actually redefining the self, so we get away from self-interest by rethinking what the self is.
Yes, in fact, in my previous chapter, in the chapter that occurs before this one, I try to articulate that idea that the self is not this kind of abstract chooser that's thoroughly self-interested, but the self just is constituted by the things we care about. And that's what the self is.
So then, I guess my question would be, sort of as teachers or as, which I think about in my role in the world, or, as we go about trying to generate this ethic of care and make things better, how do you recommend best to do that and to promote that changing of self-identity or the concept of the self?
Yeah, well, it's very complex and long-term. So you're really, the gist of this conversation thus far is that the moral personality of Americans has to change quite a bit, and that's hard. Okay, I think we have to try to design institutions in which the notion of caring for others is important. I don't think we think of institutions that way. Is a judge supposed to care about litigants? Is a manager supposed to care for her employees? Is are businesses supposed to care for their customers? Well, sometimes we think maybe they should, but we're kind of ambivalent about that. Not really. And I think our institutions have to embody this notion that when we're in these, we're always in face-to-face relationships with other people, even as representatives of institutions. And the notion of preserving that social trust that exists between us has to always be in front and center. And the language of care, I think, is better at articulating that than the language of liberty and equality. So we have to supplement this, the standard notions of liberalism, which are not which I certainly would endorse, with this notion that within institutions, they have to be arranged so that it's possible for us to engage in long-term caring relationships with the others that we're connected to. We can't do it just as individuals, because we live in a very complex society. We have to have institutions, but the institutions have to function in ways that enable the face of the other to sometimes rear its head, right? So it involves also how we design institutions themselves. And I think that the current trend is away from that, towards these very unstable institutions. To even in corporate America, it's consultants who do most of the work. They're not permanent employees. The idea of the decline of labor unions has produced employees who are just temporary. And that's not a good thing for institutions. There's no institutional memory. There's no long-term relationships. There's no way of building social trust in an institution that functions that way. So I think that our institutional design is starting to drift away from institutions that would enable us to preserve our moral capacity. So I think it is up to individuals, but also we have to think more in terms of our institutions and how they're organized. So unfortunately, human beings change only when they're confronted, often by extreme circumstances sometimes. But I think the first thing has to be to encourage this notion that, which I don't think liberalism has encouraged very much, because it tends to not to want to talk about morality. I think it's encouraged this notion that, look, our motives for caring about a stranger are the same as our motives for caring, in part, anyway, the same as our motives for caring about one's spouse or children or something like that. This ethical relation is the foundation for all of our relationships. And just as there's a modicum of responsibility and care that we have to take towards our familiar others, we have to take that level of responsibility for others as well. There's no sharp distinction between our private motives and the kinds of motives that we can operate on when we're in the public sphere. So just trying to articulate that dimension of what's already part of our psychology, I think, from a philosophical point of view, is what I'm trying to advocate here. In terms of concrete political proposals, I haven't thought all this through that, so I don't have a list of policies, but it seems to me that if we thought more in terms of that, think how if we took relationships of care to be fundamental to us, it seems to me the immigration debate would have a different shape, for instance. There's all kinds of different debates that we have that would take a different shape if we did think more in terms of that.
Including higher education.
Absolutely, no question. All of our institutions, it seems to me, including the institutions of higher education. Yeah.
I'm a student. It seems to me that this is really a problem with lower education. And what I'm saying here is that there are three arguments or three motivations for being good, like a ethos argument, the conservatives, which is eroding because we've separated church and state. And the traditional liberalism would be an argument of logos, which failed because we didn't teach critical thinking to young children, only until they get to college. So it seems that what we're left here is to take the third option, which is the argument of pathos. So I'm wondering, how could we institutionalize that?
Well, yeah, that's it's essentially a similar question to what others have asked. How do we? It's a really good question. And I'm suggesting here that when we design organizations and institutions, we have to think more in terms of, can people build long-term relationships in these institutions? Because it's stable relationships in which relationships of care can actually take place. We have to think in terms of our institutions, building those kinds of relationships. So, in other words, you might think of it this way, that the test of a policy then would be whether it helps to build social trust. Does it strengthen relationships, and does it build social capital? So when we evaluate policies, whether it's the government or some other institutions, we ask ourselves that question: does this build social trust or not? And try to avoid those policies that don't build social trust. So I think that's how you would institutionalize society. Now, not an easy task. I agree. It's not. being a philosopher, I act on the, I think on a kind of abstract level, so, you know, I don't know about specific policies to do that, but it's a good question. Yeah, John?
Dwight, correct me if I'm wrong, just, so when you go through the individual sorts of reactions or responses to each other, okay, and the ethics of care that you put out very well, there's that part of us that says it's inadequate. We can't take care of everybody's needs.
Yes.
We can't really stretch ourselves that far. So are you suggesting then that by reformulating our social institutions that it provides that little extra, I don't know, bridge
Yes.
to creating this kind of more generalist approach? And you know, is that kind of asking for a similar sort of acceptance of an abstract principle that would be similar to how you talked about equality?
Well, you can formulate it in terms of a principle, I think, but you can formulate almost anything you want into terms of a principle. And this is a big debate, as you know, in ethics about whether what role principles play and so on. So sure, you can formulate it in terms of a principle. The difference here is that this emotional, visceral response to others, I think, is a necessary condition for morality. You know, the principles in and of themselves don't work because principles don't really challenge one's will. They don't really, get one to suspend your will and think about the other person. Whereas, emotions tend to do that. So I think there's an inherent emotional dimension to our moral capacities that tends to get ignored in our philosophical tradition. So I mean, sure, you could transform this into a principle, but I would say it's not the principles that are doing so much work. It's the concrete attachments we have with others, and not just emotions, but all of the details of the interaction that goes on between people that really does most of the work with our moral reasoning. So it's very much a kind of reasoning that requires sensitivity to context more than adherence to some principle. I think you can adhere to principles and forget about all that context and think that you're doing what's right, when in fact you're ignoring the particular vulnerabilities of those people who are being affected by your policy.
So would you say then that the reorganization of these institutions would then have to also have that emotional
Yes, I think so.
aspect?
Because our concrete relations with other people are always infused with emotion. And affect generally. I mean, there's some debate about what term you want to use to describe this, whether it's emotion or something else. But our relationships with others are embodied, they're affected, they're affective, and so on.
I'm reminded of obviously feminist ethics that have presented this ethics of care.
Yes.
And you talked about face of the other, and you mentioned the word veil, and I immediately think about a kind of authoritarian government system that literally veils the face of the other,
Yes.
so she isn't considered. And authoritarian conservative forms or political affiliations, parties in this country rail against feminist ethics and talk about bleeding heart liberals.
Yes.
And all of this that you're promoting as sort of a solution to the problem is really sort of been on the table through feminist ethics and I think through people having that progressive attitude. And there are strong and severe enemies out there.
Yes.
That are willing to cut off any attempt to change institutions in this way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, in the practicality of solving problems, that's where I see it, is that somehow it's kind of like the bully in the schoolyard, and everybody can be happy and playing and having fun, and if somebody decides to be a bully, you've got to deal with aggression, and they win their way. And it's kind of, that's the way the world seems to me.
Right. I agree. I mean, the first step, I think, would be to, when people use when people criticize liberals for being bleeding heart liberals, we ought not to run away from them and say, that's right, and that's what the moral response is. It's a response from the heart, and if you don't recognize that, then there's something wrong with you. That's not how liberalism has approached this issue. They've run away from this idea that that we ought to really be concerned with others. Now, what happens when the bully wants to bully you? Well, you got to bully back. I'm not, I'm not advocating some kind of passivism here or something like that. I mean, but I think, the liberalism has to say, yeah, look, this is what we're about, and that this is what moral values are. It's not these other things that people talk about.
And I think maybe as I'm trying, it is that we need to just make the face of the other apparent at every turn. And you look at the Enron scandal, and it's like the face of the other was ignored. All those people that lost their fortunes, it was like, well, that's just the company. And now in this attorney firing case, I think maybe it's a good example where the worm is turning a little bit, because it is, oh, so what? These are just 7 or 8 people. But if we look at the face of the other, these are individuals whose lives may have been ruined. And then we can start to see, oh, that's how, and our country is being ruined by this. So, maybe that is, and when I hear certain politicians in Congress, and a lot of times it is the women, they talk in just this way,
Right.
that you're indicating that the face of the other matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not talking about something that isn't already embedded in our society in certain ways. This is not embedded in the political sphere. And we have this idea of strength of character as involving, the dynamic, uninterrupted will. The person with strength of character is the person who gets what he wants. Has the will to get what he wants. And I think that's the wrong picture of what strength of character is, at least strength of moral character.
Do you think there's a role of technology where we've actually become more disconnected from real human contact?
That's a really interesting question, and some technology seems to disconnect us from others, other technology seems to connect us. I don't know that there's a clear way of analyzing that. It seems to me technology has saved lots of lives, it's reduced suffering in lots of ways, it brings us closer in many ways, but it also has other counter tendencies, and so I think that we have to be careful about those technologies that separate us, but I also think that it's often hard to predict the effects that technology is going to have. So I think, we have to think about this a lot, but I don't think a sort of anti-technology approach is warranted, because it has very complex effects. So, I think that some of the disconnectedness of society does come about as a result of technology, but on the other hand, it offers us opportunities for connectedness as well. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that it's not really the technology, it's who owns the technology. And, if you have, TV on its own is kind of like a neutral concept, but if you're sending out, heroic messages and religious messages, maybe through Disney or superheroes or something, you're sending a really strong message. It would seem to me that, also antisocial messages that people send out, where they're, not bringing people together, this is how you get yours.
Yes.
It seems that that's really, the answer to me seems to be to find a way to buy a network or make a movie.
You're absolutely right to focus on who owns technology, who develops technology, and what's being developed for. You can develop technology that brings us closer together, or you can develop technology that doesn't. And so you have to think about, who is designing the technology and, whose interests are being served by it. I think that's absolutely right. And there are different ways of designing technology. And I think it's going to matter whether there's a kind of democratic input into how technology is designed. It's very important. Yeah.
I'm working on a line of thought here. And it starts with Rousseau. And I'm curious if you're tracing back the idea of impartiality and the outlawing of personal interest to Rousseau's concept of the general will.
Well, certainly it's there in Rousseau's. I don't know Rousseau as well as some of the other liberal thinkers, so it's there.
I think you can make a very good case for the entire idea of impartiality as an ideal, and the disregard for one's personal, and the outlawing, direct outlawing of one's personal interests. Precisely under the assumption that we have them, but we should not have them. So a normative outlawing of personal interest in Rousseau's concept of the general will. And in that case, if your ethic of care, which I also think, I'm excited, is an antidote to that within a general liberal program.
Yes.
Adding Levinas to that, which I also think is fascinating, and I love the searches, so there are a lot of things that come together here. There's some, Living Mass has a problem, and I'm wondering, Rousseau has taken care of it by outlawing personal interest, but Living Mass has not. Living Mass, there's an anecdote. Living Mass was asked, and I think I even have the interview. He's asked by an interviewer that if the face of the other is always important, always more important than your own
Yes.
interests, always setting the other's interests above your own. And the face of the other, always ask, do not harm me, etc. How about the faces of the truly bad people? Remembering that Living Mass's entire family was annihilated in the Holocaust.
That's right.
And the interviewer says, what about the faces of Eichmann? What about the faces of Kubler? These people, are they still the face of the other? What do we do if we're not allowed impartiality and we are looking at people as faces? Do we recognize that there are some people who deserve a different kind of treatment than others?
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, the question, see, this is a bit of a debate within Levinasian scholarship and so on, how to treat this. I have a particular take on how to do this, on what Levinas is up to, and I don't know that it's going to be endorsed by everybody who studies Levinas, okay, because there is it seems to me that this notion of the face of the other, this visceral response to the vulnerability of others, first of all, that's not something you can sustain for long. It's an experience that interrupts your will, and of course, we have to, if we're going to act, we have to gather our will somehow. So this is not a kind of experience that we remain in all the time, because often our social intercourse is simply going to be rather routine and habitual, and the face of the other might be operating in the background there, but we're not focused on it. This notion of this response to vulnerability and the particularity of others isn't all there is to moral reasoning. I mean, you have to stand back and say, because I have an obligation not just to you, or to you, or to you, but anybody I encounter, and there's too many people there for me to have this, this visceral response all the time. You can't live like that. So it doesn't. So the face of the other is not all there is. It's a necessary condition for morality, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't replace our practical reasoning, where we have to stand back and say, well, we have to develop a policy here, who's going to be hurt and who isn't. Now, with regard to monsters like Eichmann and the rest, I mean, it seems clear that you have to prevent them from harming others. I mean, you have to worry about those faces that are potentially, going to be harmed by these moral monsters. So I don't think there's a real issue there. But it is an important question of, does a moral monster like that have a face? Okay, and I think so. I think probably it does, but it's a face that it's going to require some kind of highly hedged response here, because you've got to protect the faces of others who may be harmed by them.
And in particular, in the last couple of days, everybody's seen a face plaster
Absolutely.
on TV over and over again.
Absolutely.
Of the murder
in Virginia Tech. Yeah, I mean, that's, exactly. And it seems to me a person who threatens in that way, well, you have to protect people. He may be a person, may have a face, certainly is a person who's vulnerable, and certainly a person who is singular, I suppose, although talking about someone who we can't grasp, fully. So yeah, I mean, he satisfies the conditions for having a face. The question of what we ought to do about him, well, or people like him, that's another question. I think you have to keep in mind that it is a person. You can't. I mean, this is why we have norms about how to treat prisoners and so on. They may be horrible people, but we still owe them some kind of humane treatment because they are a faith.
Any more questions? In that case, I think we should say thanks to Dwight.